The bull wouldn't stop screaming until a silent teen walked into the barn. The bull wouldn't stop screaming. The sound tore through the night like a living thing, low, primal, and filled with a panic no man could soothe. Inside the old barn at Halden Ridge Ranch, dust trembled from the rafters each time the massive black bull roared. Its hooves scraped violently against the straw-covered floor, striking the wooden planks beneath with thunderous weight. The handlers had tried everything, tranquilizers, chains, isolation, but Gallo wouldn't calm. His eyes were wild, rolling with something deeper than fear. No wounds, no fever, no disease. Yet the beast was clearly tormented. And every time night fell, the screaming returned like clockwork, beginning with the shadows and ending only when dawn crept across the fields. Grady Haldenridge stood just inside the barn doors, arms folded tight across his chest, jaw locked. The lantern light cast deep grooves across his weathered face. He'd raised Gallo from a calf, nursed him through storms and sickness, trained him to follow commands like a trusted dog. But this was different. Gallo didn't recognize anyone anymore, not even him. "Back away from him, Tate," Grady muttered to his oldest ranch hand, who was inching toward the bull with a sedative dart. "He's not gonna let you close tonight." Tate hesitated. Gallo slammed a horn against the support beam and let out another unearthly wail. "You're right," Tate said, slowly backing out. "This ain't natural." Grady said nothing. He only stared at the animal, unsure if what he saw in those glassy eyes was terror or guilt. Later that night, the ranch house sat in heavy silence. Dinner had gone untouched. Grady's two sons, Clay and Mason, sat on opposite sides of the long table, chewing on thoughts rather than food. Mason, the younger of the two, stared at his empty plate. He'd been quieter than usual these past few days. "I saw that boy again," Mason said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. "The one from St. Roan, Nico." Grady looked up, raising a brow. "The quiet one?" "Yeah, real good with horses. The ones that don't like to be touched? He just walks up to 'em and they settle, like he speaks without words." Clay scoffed. "We don't need some orphan kid playing whisperer with a 1,000-pound bull ready to kill itself." "We've tried everything else," Mason said. "Maybe it's not about control anymore." Grady's fingers tapped slowly against the table. The barn moaned as Gallo cried out again in the distance. That sound, like something ancient mourning the end of the world. After a moment, Grady stood. "Bring him in. Tomorrow." The next morning, the truck from St. Roan Boys Center arrived just after sunrise. A thin, silent teen stepped down from the passenger side. He wore a gray hoodie despite the July heat and carried nothing but a small canvas bag. His black boots were scuffed at the toes, his jeans hung slightly loose at the waist. But his eyes were what struck Grady the hardest. They weren't blank like some of the lost boys he'd seen come through town. They were still, like he was watching everything at once and deciding whether to say a word about it. "You Nico Dale?" Grady asked, arms crossed on the porch. The boy nodded once. "I don't care what your background is," Grady said flatly. "You keep your head down, follow orders, and you stay out of trouble. That clear?" Nico nodded again. He hadn't said a word yet. "He doesn't talk much," the driver explained. "Never has. But the animals, they listen to him." Grady narrowed his eyes. "We'll see." No one spoke. Clay broke the silence first. How's he doing that?" "I don't know," Grady murmured, staring at the pair. "But don't get close. Let him be." From that moment on, it became a pattern. Every night, as the sun began to fall, the bull would grow restless. But if Nico entered the barn, even for a few minutes, the animal would calm. It became eerie, predictable. Nico had no explanation. He never gave one. And no one dared press too hard. But something changed in Nico, too. He began waking up drenched in sweat, clutching his pillow like he was drowning. His eyes would scan the room like he was trying to remember where he was. Then he'd sit for hours, staring at nothing. Clay caught him once, whispering under his breath. Just one name, over and over. Wes. Clay didn't mention it to Grady. But Mason noticed things too. Nico had started carrying a Bible with him, though no one ever saw him open it. One evening, as they cleaned the tool shed together, Mason knocked it over by accident. As he reached down to help Nico gather the pages, something slipped out. It was a photo. Old, faded, water-damaged. It showed a younger version of Gallo, unmistakable by the distinct scar over his left eye. Standing beside him was a man with a crooked smile and broad shoulders, a rodeo man. Mason stared at it, confused, until he saw the name printed at the bottom, Wes Dale and Gallo the Untamed. He blinked. Nico had never told them his last name. He looked back at the photo and froze. The man? He looked exactly like Nico, just older. He looked up slowly. Nico had already taken the photo back, slipping it into the Bible without a word. "Where did you get that?" Mason asked quietly. Nico didn't answer. His eyes dropped, and he turned away, walking back toward the barn. That night, Grady sat with a ledger book and an old bottle of ranch paperwork, flipping through receipts and auction logs. He found Gallo's transfer papers, dated 10 years ago, sold as a calf, healthy, male. No notes on previous owners except a half-legible stamp from a place called Shadowbrush Acres, a ranch that had burned down over 20 years ago. He sat back, heart thudding. 10 years ago? That bull should be 10 years old. But the photo Mason had shown him, Wes Dale and Gallo, was dated 23 years ago. Grady rubbed a hand across his mouth, then leaned forward, squinting at the photo Mason had snuck to him. The scar on Gallo's eye, it was identical. Same angle, same shape. No mistaking it. He glanced toward the window. The barn was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, Grady Haldenridge felt something on his ranch that he couldn't fix with calloused hands and common sense. He felt a ghost. And this was the same bull. Grady swore Gallo had been born 10 years ago, but the photo was dated 23 years back. Grady Haldenridge slapped the photo onto the breakfast table, the image curling slightly at the edges from years of handling. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded, eyes locked on the silent boy across from him. Nico didn't flinch. He kept his gaze low, staring at the steam rising from the scrambled eggs on his plate. His fork rested untouched. "I asked you a question," Grady said, voice sharper this time. "This man, Wes Dale, that your father?" Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Grady!" "No," Grady cut in, eyes still fixed on Nico. "He brought a photo into my house. With my bull. That ain't normal." Nico's lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't speak. Not a single word. The kitchen was thick with silence. Outside the window the barn sat still, but every man at the table could feel Gallo's presence, like a storm crouched behind the wood. Grady let out a long breath and leaned back. "Fine. Keep your secrets." He stood, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. "But don't think I won't get answers." After he left, Mason looked over at Nico. "You don't have to tell him anything," he said softly, "but I think he's scared. I think we all are." Nico finally lifted his eyes. They were heavy with something more than fear, grief maybe, or guilt, but he said nothing. Grady spent most of the day in the old tack room, boxes of yellowed papers and brittle receipts spread across the floor. He flipped through livestock ledgers and auction manifests, fingers smudged with ink and dust. Gallo's records were thin, purchased from an anonymous source at a clearance auction in the north end of Greystone County. The seller's name was illegible, just a messy scribble and a half-torn seal from a ranch called Shadowbrush Acres. Grady frowned. He knew that name. The place had burned to the ground 15 years ago after a lightning strike. There were no survivors, and no surviving livestock, at least according to reports. Except Gallo. He leaned back on his heels and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "What in the world are you, boy?" he muttered aloud. Every evening Nico returned to the barn. He didn't feed Gallo or touch him. He didn't try to train or lead. He just sat, sometimes cross-legged, sometimes leaning against the stall's frame, always silent. And Gallo, this beast that had terrified grown men, remained quiet too, calm, watchful. But one night, Mason decided to follow him in. The barn was dim, lit only by the soft yellow glow of a hanging bulb. Nico was in his usual place, but he wasn't silent. Mason froze just inside the door, pressing himself against a post. "Wes! Wes! Come back!" The words were whispered like a prayer. Nico rocked slightly where he sat, repeating the name in a trembling voice. "Wes, come back." Then something incredible happened. Gallo, usually stiff and distant even in Nico's presence, stepped forward, slowly. His massive hooves thudded softly in the straw. He leaned down, lowering his head until his forehead gently touched Nico's shoulder. The boy didn't move. And then the bull let out a sound Mason had never heard from an animal before. It wasn't a growl, not a snort. It was something like a cry, low, mournful, human. Mason backed out of the barn, heart hammering. The next morning, Rick, the oldest ranch hand, nearly retired, was trimming Gallo's hooves when he noticed something odd. He straightened, wiping his brow, and frowned at the clean-cut surface. "These look too fresh," he muttered, tapping a hoof. "Ain't right." He called Grady over. "Look here," Rick said, pointing. "You see how smooth the growth lines are? That ain't normal for a bull his age. No cracks, no age rings, like these just came in yesterday." Grady narrowed his eyes. "You saying he's younger than before?" Rick shrugged. "I'm saying this don't make sense." Grady stared at the bull, who stood calmly at the edge of the pen, watching Nico rake hay nearby. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get an expert." Later that week, a livestock specialist named Jarrett Connor arrived from Rannoch Ridge. Tall, thin, with a strange habit of talking to himself under his breath, Jarrett ran his hands along Gallo's back, inspected his teeth, hooves, and joints. He took blood samples and hair swabs and murmured notes to his clipboard. After 2 hours, he stood in the barn doorway, flipping through test data. "According to this," Jarrett said slowly, "his cell structures are regenerating faster than I've ever seen. Tissue age doesn't match expected wear. I'd say he's closer to 5 years than 10. "That's impossible," Grady snapped. "I've had him for 11. Jarrett shrugged, wide-eyed. "Then either that bull's part miracle, or he ain't what you think he is." The barn went silent. Grady walked Jarrett out to his truck without a word. The door shut with a hollow thud. When he turned back, he saw Nico and Mason standing side by side at the fence. Nico was looking at the ground. That night, the moon was high and full. The field shimmered silver, and the barn stood like a shadow at the heart of it all. Mason and Nico walked in silence, heading back from the main house after a late dinner. The path near the old well was overgrown, but Mason always cut through it. Tonight, though, something caught their eye. A glint in the dirt, faint but steady. Mason knelt down and started clearing it. Nico didn't move. He was frozen, eyes wide, hands clenched at his sides. "Help me clear this," Mason said. Together they dug with their hands until a strip of leather came free, torn, caked with dried mud and blood, stiff from age. Mason turned it over and wiped it clean with his sleeve. It was a rodeo belt, faded. The buckle still shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Carved into the worn leather were the initials, WD. Nico staggered backward. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, as though trying to keep something inside from breaking loose. A cold wind blew through the grass, bending it low. The air shifted, and from the barn behind them, Gallo let out a single sharp bellow. Mason turned. "That didn't sound like him," he whispered. They ran. Inside the barn, Gallo was losing control. He was thrashing again, more violently than ever, slamming against the walls, kicking up wooden boards and scattering buckets. Nico rushed forward, hands out. "Gallo!" he shouted. The bull didn't stop. Nico stepped into the pen, ignoring Mason's call behind him. He stood firm as the beast stormed toward him, horn barely missing his shoulder as he dove to the side. Mason ran in, trying to pull him back, but Nico pushed his hand away. The bull spun around, eyes wild with something that looked less like rage and more like recognition. It locked eyes with Nico, then charged again. The impact was deafening. Wood exploded as Gallo smashed a beam clean in half. The stall door flew off its hinges. Mason yelled for help. Grady arrived seconds later, shotgun in hand, face pale. "Get back!" he barked. "No!" Nico shouted, standing in the bull's path. "Don't!" Grady raised the gun. Gallo stomped and snorted, flaring with energy. "He's remembering," Nico said. Grady's hands tensed on the shotgun. "Something buried with my father." The shovel struck something solid. Mason froze. The dull thunk beneath the layers of damp soil wasn't the resistance of a stone. It was hollow, wood-like, faintly echoing. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the morning chill, and he quickly looked to Nico, who had paused mid-swing. They had been digging for nearly 3 hours, just behind the old well, driven by nothing more than a hunch. Or maybe something deeper. Something felt. Mason crouched and brushed away the remaining dirt with his hands. A corner emerged, splintered and rotted from years beneath the earth. He kept clearing until the edge of a small wooden box revealed itself, darkened with time and soaked in cold mud. Nico silently joined him. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the rusted latch. It didn't take much effort. The lock had long since failed. The lid creaked open with a groan, the hinges clinging to their last threads of metal. Inside was a coil of frayed rope, a bull spur twisted with rust, and a folded letter sealed with cracked, brittle wax. Nico stared at it. His chest rose and fell as if he were afraid the contents would bite. Mason reached out. "You want me to?" But Nico had already picked it up. The wax crumbled in his hand. He unfolded the page slowly. The writing was faded, water-damaged in places, but most of the words were still legible. His eyes scanned the paper in silence, expression slowly hardening with each line. Mason leaned closer, trying to read over his shoulder. The signature was still clear. Wes Dale. Mason stepped back as if struck. Nico remained still, eyes locked on the paper. "What does it say?" Mason asked. Nico handed it over without a word. Mason read quickly, his lips silently forming the words. The letter was a confession. Wes Dale had survived a rodeo accident, badly. Gallo had trampled him, not out of rage, but by accident during a fall. The injuries should have been fatal, but Gallo didn't leave him, not for hours, not for days. The bull had stood over his broken body through a full storm. Wes should have died, but he didn't. And that's when the dream started. He wrote of whispers in his sleep, of voices urging him to speak back to the bull. Not commands, not names, feelings, memories, pieces of something that felt older. He said the bull responded, began to change, healing faster, moving sharper, even aging slower. People began to notice. Wes had panicked. He couldn't explain what was happening, and the deeper he went, the harder it became to live normally. He faked his death, vanished, buried the letter, the spur, and the belt as a warning, and maybe as a map in case the bull ever called someone else. "For my son," the last line read, "if he ever comes looking." Mason looked up slowly. Nico was already walking away. Back at the main house, Grady stood at the kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hand. When the boys returned with the box, he didn't ask what they'd found. He just watched Nico place the letter on the table and nod once. Grady read it alone. The others sat quietly. When he finished, he leaned against the counter, face pale. "I never told anyone this," he began, voice low. "When I bought Gallo, it wasn't from an auction like I claimed. Not really. He was delivered. Late at night, from a truck with no markings, no paperwork except a name I couldn't even pronounce. The man who dropped him off didn't speak, not until the very end." He looked at Nico. He was skinny, eyes hollow, wore an old rodeo vest, looked like he hadn't slept in years. But before he left, he leaned in and said, "He remembers the pain." Then he was gone. Never saw him again. "That was him," Mason said, barely above a whisper. "That was Wes." Grady nodded slowly. "I didn't know what I was taking in. I just thought he was broken." "He was," Nico said, finally speaking. "But not alone." That night, everything changed. The wind was wrong. It howled not from the north as usual, but from all sides at once, swirling through the barnyard like a storm without rain. The skies were clear, yet the air felt heavy, soaked with a tension no one could name. Grady sent Clay and the hands home early. "No one steps near that barn tonight," he said. But Mason and Nico stayed. They stood near the fence line, eyes on the barn doors, which creaked open and shut in the wind. The cattle in the nearby pastures were restless, huddled against each other. One calf had to be pulled aside, its eyes turned white, unseeing, but no signs of injury. The vet couldn't explain it. The shadows moved differently that night. Long, stretched, bending even where there was no light. "What's happening?" Mason whispered. Nico didn't answer. His arms hung loosely at his sides. He was whispering something under his breath again, the same phrase, over and over. "Not alone, not alone, not alone." Grady stood on the porch, shotgun leaning against the rail, unsure whether to guard or flee. Then the screaming began again. Gallo's bellow tore through the ranch like thunder. But this time, it wasn't anger or pain. It was layered, deep, like two voices woven together. A second sound followed it, the wind echoing in perfect sync, as if the earth itself were screaming with him. Everyone froze. "Go!" Grady yelled. "Now!" But Nico was already moving. He walked to the barn, not fast, not slow, just steady, as though he wasn't afraid of what waited inside. Mason started after him, but Grady caught his arm. "Let him," he said. The doors slammed shut behind Nico. Inside, the barn was pitch black, except for the lantern swaying from the beam. Gallo stood in the center stall, head low, chest heaving like a machine about to break apart. Nico stepped forward. No fear, just certainty. He took the letter from his pocket, unfolded it, and placed it against the bull's chest. "You were trying to save him," he whispered. The bull lifted its head. "You're still trying." Gallo let out a soft groan, almost like a breath. His knees buckled, not from pain, but surrender, and he dropped gently to the straw-covered floor. His eyes blinked slowly. The air changed. It warmed, suddenly and completely, like the first breath of spring after a brutal winter. It swept through the barn and out into the fields, making every man outside pause and look up. Inside, Gallo exhaled once more, a long, low sigh. Then, silence. No creaking, no wind, no voice, just peace. For the first time in weeks, the barn was silent. The old barn groaned softly in the wind, but inside, everything was still. Gallo stood in the corner of his stall, quiet and steady, his head low, eyes calm. Weeks had passed since the night of the final scream, since Nico pressed that fragile letter to the bull's chest and spoke the words that had broken something wide open, grief, memory, maybe even time itself. Since then, Gallo hadn't made a sound beyond the occasional breath. He didn't thrash. He didn't cry. He simply lived. But he didn't age either. Mason had checked. So had Grady. The rings on the hooves, the texture of the hide, the eyes, still clear, still youthful. Gallo didn't get older, yet he didn't grow younger either. It was as if the strange tide that had overtaken him had finally settled, leaving behind something new, something whole. Grady didn't talk about it much, and no one dared ask the vet again. Some things weren't meant to be studied. They were just meant to be respected. Life on the ranch continued. The storm clouds were gone. The grass grew thick again in the pastures, and the cows returned to their grazing without fear. Even the dogs stopped barking at the barn at night. The unease that had hung over Halden Ridge Ranch like a weight had lifted, like fog burned away by morning light. Nico stayed. At first it was assumed he'd leave when the summer ended, that he'd return to St. Rone Boys Center. But one morning, Grady found him repairing a broken gate on the south pasture, tools in hand, sleeves rolled up, quiet and focused. "You know that ain't your job," Grady said, approaching with slow steps. Nico didn't look up. "I know," he answered. Grady watched him for a moment, then nodded. "It is now." He offered Nico a permanent place, not just to work, but to live. He cleared out the old tool shed by the workshop and helped Mason convert it into a bunkhouse. It wasn't big, but it was warm, dry, safe. The walls were painted, a cot set in the corner, a desk by the window. Grady even hung a single photo above the doorway, an old image of the ranch when it was first built. He didn't say anything when he put it up. He just left the hammer on the floor and walked away. Nico made it his home. As the days passed, he began to speak more. At first, just in fragments, quiet replies, short observations, then full thoughts. One afternoon, while Mason mucked the stalls, Nico leaned against the fence and said, "He used to hum during the rides." Mason turned. "Your dad?" Nico nodded. "Even when he was getting thrown, he'd hum. Said it helped him stay loose." Mason grinned. Sounds like something a crazy man would do. Nico smiled faintly. He was. They shared more after that, over chores, during rides, on nights sitting beneath the stars. Nico told stories of the rodeos he'd watched as a kid, how his father would let him hide in the trailer while the announcer called his name. He remembered the way Wes talked about Gallo, not just as an animal, but as a partner, a friend. He used to say, Nico recalled one night, that Gallo wasn't like the others, that he didn't buck out of rage. He bucked because he remembered something too deep to carry. Mason was quiet a moment. What do you think it was? Nico looked toward the barn. Loss, same as the rest of us. One afternoon, Grady called out from the north barn. You boys better get in here. They ran. Inside, lying in the straw, was a newborn calf. Jet black, with a strange silver streak running down its nose like a paintbrush had left a single perfect mark. Mason knelt beside it. Did we know one of the cows was pregnant? Grady shook his head. Vet said the cycle was off, didn't think it took. The three of them stood in silence. Gallo loomed just behind the newborn, still and watchful. But there was no tension, no fear. The older bull seemed to be guarding the calf, not out of dominance, but out of reverence. Mason stared at the little creature as it stirred. You think it's just a calf? Nico didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, watching how Gallo's massive head lowered beside the newborn, breathing slow and deep. The old bull gave a soft exhale, and the calf nuzzled into his side. Nico turned to Mason. I think it's a beginning. That evening, as dusk sank into the hills and the wind carried the scent of pine and hay across the pastures, Grady stood alone by the fire pit near the edge of the field. Mason and Nico arrived quietly, carrying the old belt and the letter. Grady didn't speak. He took them from the boys with steady hands. The belt had frayed more since they'd unearthed it, the initials WD barely visible under the soot stains. The letter was folded and tied with twine. Grady looked at Nico. You sure? Nico nodded. It was never meant to last, just to be heard. Grady placed the items in the fire. The flames took them quickly, curling paper, burning leather, releasing a brief pop as the wax seal crumbled into embers. Mason tossed another log on the fire. They stood there for a long while, saying nothing. As the flames crackled, a breeze stirred the trees behind them. Not cold, not harsh, but soft, gentle. Like a breath against the back of the neck, Nico tilted his head slightly. It wasn't just wind. It was a whisper, so faint it could have been imagined. But it wasn't frightening. It was warm, familiar. A voice he hadn't heard in years, saying nothing in particular, but still saying everything. Mason looked up. Did you hear that? Grady frowned slightly. What? Nothing, Nico said quietly. He didn't flinch. He stood tall. His shoulders didn't shake, and his hands didn't tremble. His silence wasn't hollow anymore. Whatever haunted Gallo had found peace, and so had he.